All right, thank you very much. It's good to be here and it's good to share some of the findings of the panel. They've only given us 20 minutes, so we're going to have to dash through this. 20 minutes for what feels like hundreds of thousands of hours of thinking and discussion, eh, Amelia? Yeah. But really delighted to be able to share some reflections. Cabinet appointed an independent panel, of which Amelia and I were both members. So was Rachel Brooking, Roman Peart, Kevin Prime, and of course Tony Randerson, who I think his toes curl every time that it's called the Randerson Report, but maybe underneath he's secretly proud. I've just got to clear up one thing. I got many pieces of feedback from those that know me. I am not a planner. And I'm not a lawyer, I am a civil engineer and I am proud of it. And it was awesome to be on a panel that's looking at planning legislation. So look, we're going to talk about the drivers for change. We'll touch briefly on terms of reference, the legislative proposal, and then between Amelia and I we will share reflections on, in a bit more detail around each of the proposed acts. Can I just clear up one thing, and that's around the terms of reference. Look, they were broad, they were inclusive, but there was two things that weren't included, and I thought it's worth just highlighting those, and amongst everything that I could have said was in. First of all, reform of local government was excluded, although I suspect if you read the report you'll find that we've made some subtle suggestions about the reform of local government. And Tony goes as far in his foreword to say that 78 local authorities and over 100 regional and district plans and 5 million people doesn't seem to make sense. And then the rights of Maori as they relate to fresh water, both were exclusions. So what were some of those drivers for change? I just want to touch on a few, and I'll also invite Amelia when I finish just to give a few of her reflections. Look, as a panel, we needed to rapidly identify what we considered the problem statement, but also the opportunity statement was. And we did that through the Issues and Opportunities report. Many of you should have, if you haven't read it, go back and do so. As I reflect on it, the key drivers were there is an evidence base for continued degradation of our natural and physical environment. We see urban areas struggling with how to handle growth and the related infrastructure provision. We saw that managing the effects of resource use was driving us to a lowest common denominator rather than taking an outcomes-based approach. We saw a bias to the status quo. So we weren't allowed to change anything, even if the science and even if the intergenerational effects were taking us in a different direction. And the RMA had become unworkable in some respects because of the amendments. Not all of them were consistent with each other. So we're at the point in time after 30 years where we needed to do something. But that's also accompanied by a lot of opportunity. The opportunity for strategic planning, the opportunity for taking that outcomes-based approach, opportunity for recognising Te Tiriti and our partnership relationship with Māori. So there's a whole lot of things inside there that we saw as both challenges and opportunities, dealing with complexity, simplify, looking at capability and capacity across the sector to help us plan for and deliver what is complex solutions. So, yep, the existing, did you want anything you wanted to add? I just went...
So you can imagine the panel dynamics now.
I am looking at the clock.
No, the only thing I was going to add in there about thinking about the considerations for infrastructure, I think the two observations I would make about that driver for change, and we can have a big argument about whether the existing system is an implementation error or a structure of the Act error, but I think we can't dispute the outcomes aren't delivering what we want. And I think that was the other perspective that I just wanted to reflect on. We're not aligning, the Act is not aligning with the community's expectations, whether that's infrastructure providers' expectations or the communities in which are being impacted by that infrastructure or those environments. So it was those things in combination, I think, and that was just the only additional point I had from yours, Dean.
That was a very nice additional point, thank you. Look, I just want to talk about the current state. Simple diagram there. one of the first issues we needed to tackle was, what do we think that future architecture of the legislation looked like? And the panel landed in 2 or 3 main schools of thought. The first one was our proposal. We'll touch on that, so I won't say any more. The second one was that you have separate acts, one dealing with the natural environment and one dealing with the built environment. We also had urban and rural land split. We didn't know how to deal with that, so we discarded that quickly. But the panel was unanimous and got to that point very quickly, that we felt it was still leading edge to take an integrated approach to how you deal with all of these issues that need to be, from strategic planning through into how you deal with outcomes as a result of ongoing development. Which probably puts me in strong contrast to some of Hamish or Infrastructure New Zealand's position on this matter, which you may have heard before. But quite frankly, we didn't care, and Hamish and I have had many debates on the matter, because we think that the Strategic Planning Act does deal with the very question that he's challenged us with. So in our view, to split would weaken, and it would take us backwards. So we came up with this, and we'll talk about the Strategic Planning Act, the Natural Built Environments Act, and the Managed Retreat one. This was, in our view, the preferred combination. Okay. The Strategic Planning Act. So just to touch on that very briefly, it sets the long-term. Its objective is to set long-term strategic goals and facilitate that integration of resource planning and infrastructure planning and delivery across and integrate across those other pieces of legislation. So you do have this complexity of Local Government Act, LTMA, the Climate Change Response Act. It also, and we had a lot of discussion around this, we also tried to give it the additional oomph of addressing the funding component to that. So you can have a rhetoric inside a strategic plan, but the rhetoric has to be matched with agreement around how you will fund and finance that. So we've tried to bring that into that strategic plan so we are more confident about delivery. We've also addressed, as you can see, there are a number of other challenges around mandatory elements within it, especially to deal with landside and the interface with the CMA. Given some real strength to taking a regional approach, we've given ministerial flexibility around sequencing and timing and how you handle that. But the Strategic Planning Act is designed for communities to plan out for what they need into the future. And on that note, I will hand over to Amelia. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you. So I was the planner in the room on the panel. So we had 3 lawyers, I think. Environment Commissioner, Mr Prime as an engineer, Dean as an engineer, and myself as the sole planner in the room, but I think we put up a good fight. And look, I'm going to talk about a topic that I literally could talk about for about 2 hours in 8 minutes. So lean forward and I'll take a breath and we'll go. So the proposal is that the MBEA would replace the Act, and as Dean has said, it would retain some of those really key principles about integration and sustainability and the well-being of present and future generations. I think it is arguably moving from a Sustainable Management Act, which is what we had in 1991, to one that's about sustainable development. And I'm going to sort of put some case together about why I think that time is right for that change. And it's really about working towards setting outcomes. Now, it's not the legislation that will set those outcomes, it is government. It's local government and central government that will set those outcomes, and our national directions and plans we maintain are the instruments to do that. But it is about setting those outcomes and targets to get there, and how that is different, I suppose, from our current system. And to me as a geographer, before I move to the world of planning, it's analogous to, we've worked in a system now for 30 years where we've said our destination is Taupo, but the way we've evaluated whether we're getting there is proposal by proposal. We've asked ourselves, is this getting us any further away from Taupo? Or, that's all we've done from an effects assessment. Are we making this a little bit worse? Is it, substantially worse? And that's how we've been making our decision making. The fundamental difference with this Act is it's about setting a direction. We want to get to Taupo. mapping those routes, and then making decisions, asking ourselves the question, is this getting us closer to Taupo? I think simply that's the big change in terms of the legislative reform that we're proposing. A few other things I just wanted to touch on in terms of key element and change. It's about redefining the environment, and that natural and built environments is core to that, but also introducing the concept of te mana o te taiao into the definition for the environment. So it is saying we have a New Zealand environmental ethic that we should be proud of. It's a Māori one and it's a European one, and it's a combination of those and embedding that philosophy. So it's trying to address some of those challenges that Dean touched on at the beginning. And it's a shift away, and I think this is also critical at the moment in terms of where we are for infrastructure provision, for urbanism, and certainly for climate change. It's a shift away from the presumption of stationarity. So no longer are we assessing and assuming that the status quo is the environmental outcome we want, that our existing condition is the environmental outcome we want. It is that target and outcome that we're driving to. And then finally, it's about bringing in a number of other changes that respond to some of those drivers, providing improvements for certainty, reducing complexity, and really ensuring and delivering some consistency for projects across the country. And again, I think that's central to infrastructure. Just really quickly touching on how we've done each of those. One is absolutely beefing up the amount of national direction that we're looking for. And I think this goes to some of the comments and criticisms that we've heard. I think there has been a lack of national direction provided, and that is where outcomes can be really brought to the fore. So to me, we've identified it's a ministerial duty to set a number of those national directions, and those national directions will cover a much broader range than they currently do now. So not just the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, but importantly, how the principles of the treaty will be given effect to, and how local councils, and that, to me that's addressing a massive gap that we've seen in our system, each local council trying to interpret how they're going to give effect to those principles, or in fact whether even local government should be giving, taking a responsibility of the Crown and delivering those principles. The intent is a lot of that legislation will be set through national direction. The second point to achieve some of that consistency is about making sure that that national direction deals with the conflicts that are in it at the time of its development. So again, a point that Hamish, I think, made in his presentation earlier, we know we currently have a system where conflicts are left to being dealt with at resource consenting stage or at proposal development stage. And the intent is with this that those conflicts are resolved through that national direction and upfront. And then the third is about having some ownership in terms of how that's developed, and particularly about MFE being the mechanism or the instrument, the agent, to deliver that, and Board of Inquiry being the mechanism. So we're getting some science into the consideration and development of those policy statements. The second massive change is about the planning framework itself, and again, Dean alluded to this. It's about preparing combined plans and reducing the number. So at the moment, we've got over 100 plans, and that is really a huge drive to me about inconsistency and complexity in the system. It also gives rise to the poor consistency that we have in those plans. So you can have, I'm doing some work for emergency services providers and community hubs at the moment, and that ranges from a permitted activity in some jurisdictions to a non-complying activities in others, in effectively what is the same zone. And that is to do with how territorial authorities are perceiving and managing acts, not on the effects that they're having or the outcomes that we're wanting to deliver. And the third, the responsiveness is variable as well, and some of that is attributed to the capacity of councils, and we understand that. And so this proposal, it is a big and brave proposal, and it certainly will require big culture change, is to amalgamate and require those councils to work collaboratively in a combined plan process. And as Dean said, it is not restructuring local government, but it is perhaps setting a different way of working between some of those councils around the country. And the only other thing I wanted to note, it is 14 of those, so there are some unitary authorities there that also get brought into the requirement for that collaborative working. Getting close to the end now, because I can see the clock ticking down, some of the changes in consents. And the 2 or 3 big drivers that I wanted to make a point on here in terms of infrastructure provision, it's really about providing some certainty on notification and getting rid of some of that discretion, because I think that has taken a huge amount of energy out of our system. 95% of our consents aren't notified, and yet more than 50% of our time processing consents is often the decision to notify or not. So providing certainty on that and providing direction on where it is, removing some of the consent activity statuses, in particular non-complying activity, reducing the number of consents through that combined planning process, and also introducing an alternate dispute resolution pathway, so a non-appealable pathway for consents of defined character or neighbourhood dispute kind of issues in the urban environment. I did really briefly want to touch on some of the status quo and change issues, and again, this is just touching again on a comment that Dean was talking to about how we can no longer accept stationarity. We can no longer accept that the baseline for our environmental consideration should be the condition we're in. And I think urbanism has been a big driver of that, and the MPS for Urban Development has tried to respond to that recently. And the other one that we're facing at the other end in the physical environment is the climate change response that we need to make. And so there are a number of changes that we are recommending in respect of allocation and in respect of rethinking some of the existing use rights and permitted baseline considerations in the legislation that are quite substantial to that change, and I just wanted to highlight those. And then finally, I think, systems oversight. And again, I think this is an area of great weakness in our current regime, our current resource management system, and there are some significant gaps. And we make a number of recommendations that tries to re-emphasise how the system is monitoring progress towards those outcomes, rather than monitoring the processes that are established by the legislation itself. And we've made, again, some recommendations about how that could be integrated and work collaboratively to try and address some of the capability and capacity gaps. I won't touch on that one because I know that I've got to give Dean enough time to talk about climate change, which is also a really significant part of the recommendations.
Except to say that we did spend a lot of time on this subject, didn't we?
I know.
Yeah, and we've got, I think, some quite strategic advice here about how this should be organised. So I've just done a slide for you, haven't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Right, can we just, we're in home stretch now, we've got 2 or 3 slides left, and then hopefully we've whetted your appetite. Climate change and hazards were also a significant part of our discussion. This is a reflection of New Zealand, but also what we see happened in the past, but also what we see happening into the future in relation to climate change related effects. Look, the Natural Built Environments Act has been designed as per our report to deal with a reduction of risk and natural hazards. So how do we do that, and how do we do that in a legislative context? How do we build, improve resilience to the effects of climate change with a focus on adaptation? How do we, or requiring us to address, reduce the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and promote activities that mitigate for those emissions? So we've come up with a number of recommendations. They include mandatory national directions. Amelia's touched on those, but particularly focus on climate change mitigation, adaptation. And we expect the Strategic Planning Act itself to consider how land use and changes in that land use need to be managed as we think into the future around how we plan cities and communities, the infrastructure they need, and how our land or areas become increasingly vulnerable. What will we do? How do we give people and communities time to change and adapt? Okay, alongside of that is also protection of vulnerable ecosystems. How do we want to do that? We expect that thinking to occur through the Strategic Planning Act. Which leads us to this issue of managed retreat and climate change. What we tried to put this into the Natural Built Environment Act. We tried to put it into the Climate Change Response Act. What we found is we couldn't. Somebody else might be able to crack that nut, and all power to them. What we, in effect, have come up and recommended is that a specific piece of legislation that allows us to deal with how we manage retreat from vulnerable areas, how we think about how that might be funded or the liability associated with those issues, so that local government and central government can move together more positively in resolving those issues. Okay, we don't have anything that allows us in a reasonable fashion to chart a course forward. We're doing it in an ad hoc, bespoke fashion to date. So we've made some quite specific recommendations once again around how this should be treated, managed retreat and climate change adaptation. I want to finish on my last slide. I've got 11 seconds to do so. The last slide's all about transition. I started off, look, the transition, quite simply, is just to get on with it. I mean, we've been sitting on this one, it's been debated for 10 years. It should not be a question of if, it's a case of when. So on that note, I think, Leslie, we look at you and say the MFE, charge on. I was really pleased to see David Parker was saying they're going to charge on. Actually, from a panel point of view, we don't mind quite where we land, but we want to land, okay? So there is a lot of things to be thought about. We can start transition now. We don't need to get all the legislation in place. We can start to think about culture and capability and do all of those things that we know will come, because 30 years ago we had a lot of practice at it. So on that note, we will finish. We're 35 seconds late, so I think that's pretty good. And thank you so much for listening.